So we created a 30 frame long jump animation in the last video, and it wasn't anything too special, but it was not too shabby for a couple minutes worth of work. So we have that jump animation, and it runs about a second long, and it doesn't have a whole lot of personality to it, meaning the block just kind of moves up in the air and then falls back down. It doesn't really have that squashing and stretching that we studied in the principles, which kind of would create that believability and some of that illusion of physicality to this animation. So that's what we want to get applied here. But to do that, we need to add a new parameter, a new transformation. So position is just not enough. We have to add one to this item in order to really get that sense of squashing and stretching. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to select my blue block, and I'm going to go ahead and add a new parameter called scale. Scale is probably one that you probably have seen before, and if you kind of were messing around with this one, you might have noticed that you can kind of squash and stretch your block just by grabbing those handles. Or you might be familiar with that type of input from Photoshop or even Illustrator. So you probably know it's there, but we can't animate it unless we bring it up as a parameter or a transform on our object. So we can go ahead and hit the S key for scale. And doing that brings up the scale property. Much like position, we have to turn on the stopwatch if we want to create keyframes and animate that property. So let's do that. And we notice that a keyframe is created just like before. We notice that the keyframe is showing here in the current time keyframe slot. And that's about it. If we hit spacebar, we notice that our block is animating just like before. No real change there. So there it goes. And we're not getting the squash and stretch yet. So just adding scale is not nearly enough. We have to actually animate the scale also. So let's do that. So what we're going to do is first is when I bring my block up, I'm going to have it stretch out first. So that's a vertical stretching, as though it's kind of leaping up in the air. So my first movement of scale is going to require that I stretch this thing horizontally and out vertically, which means I'm going to have to turn off the lock proportions setting. Because what I want to do, and I can either do it transforming in the composition or down in the numeric panel. But what I'm going to do is a non-uniform transformation. So I move my timeline indicator just far enough out to where, say, my block is like 50% of the way toward the top of its jump. And then I'm going to take the X value and I'm going to stretch it in, let's just say to 50. And then the Y value, I'm going to stretch out to say 150, because we want to kind of keep the volume in a similar size. So we're going half in and half out, or at least 50% in, 50% out. So that way my object, as it's jumping, is going to stretch out as it reaches the top of its jump. Now, at the top of its jump, we want it to return back to normal, because we would assume that all of its stretching, all that mass would catch up to itself. So here we go. This will be back to 100, and this will be back to 100 as well. And that's at the height of its jump, so right at 15 frames. So here's what we have. Stretching in, jump, out, and then it's falling. So let's go ahead and have that stretch come back. So about halfway down, we're going to go back to 50% on the width and 150% on the height. And so we're getting it, it's like it's a little bit of jelly. And then when it lands at 1 second, then we need it to go back to the way that it was. So let's go back to 100 and 100. So let's preview that new animation with squash and stretch applied. Here we go. And there's a whole lot of dead time here. I'll show you how to get rid of that in just a moment. One more time. And one more time. All right, a little more personality, not quite right. So let's get that fixed. One thing to do before we do that is I want to change what in my preview is actually being previewed. Because right now I have about 10 seconds in my animation and I just don't need 10 seconds. So I could do this two ways. I could either change my composition length, go into comp settings, and cut this from 10 to say, I don't know, 3 seconds. That's probably all I need. So 0.3, hit OK. And then now when I preview, I don't have to wait so long for that preview to come back around and see my jump animation. 3 seconds feels pretty good. There's a little bit of a, kind of a breather at the end before it starts one more time. The other thing that I could do is move my work area preview, or my, it's called a time ruler as well. So I could move this work area endpoint inward, and notice that it changes the shaded area. And what that does is it just changes what After Effects previews. And so right now it's just previewing what's in that kind of gray bounding area. I can change this on the fly and drag it out, hit spacebar again, and then it gives me a little bit more in that preview area. That's fine. If I have my timeline indicator outside of this area, it'll still preview. Well, it still should preview outside of that area, but right now it's just kind of doing it within that area. So just kind of know that that's the option you have to kind of focus on what you want to preview. This is really helpful when you have other things in your timeline that you don't want to focus on at that moment. You really want to drill in on this one piece. So, but at any rate, before I showed you that, I kind of mentioned that our animation wasn't quite right. So let me dig into what I mean by that. Well, squashing and stretching is all well and good, but squashing and stretching kind of happens with a little bit of a delay to be most believable. So the problem we have here is that our object is jumping up in the air and it is then stretching, but then it's starting to come back to its full size before it reaches the height of its jump, which is a little less believable. It's almost as though like it's kind of putting on the brakes in the air. And that scaled adjustment needs to happen slightly after it hits its peak. So, and the same thing happens for when it's kind of coming back down to rest. That scale adjustment should happen after it hits as a result of it colliding with the floor. So we kind of need to see both parameters at the same time, position and scale, in order to make this change. So let's do that. I'm going to select my blue block and I'm going to hold the Shift key while hitting the P key. And that's going to bring up both position and scale. So if you notice, I hit the P key, it's just position, S key, just scale. If I hold Shift, I can kind of do groupings of those, right? So I want position and scale both up at the same time. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change where those scale keyframes occur, and then I'm going to iterate on this animation to try and make it the most believable. To start, I'm just going to cause the scale movements to happen slightly after the others. So that way the position starts to move and then things start to stretch out. And it's going to hit the height of its jump and then things start to recoil. And then it's going to come back down to the ground and then it'll start to resume its other shape. And that's starting to look a little bit better. I might need to offset this just a little bit more. Let's see what it looks like. The lift is starting to look pretty good, but then it's still a little bit odd coming down from the top. So let's go ahead and get that fixed. So here we are. We've got it up at the top of our jump. Possibly we just need a little bit more what I call hang time at the top. So it's starting to come down too soon. So let's go ahead and fix that. We created a position keyframe for the height of the jump. If we want it to hang out at the height a little bit longer, all we have to do is we can copy that keyframe and paste it, or we can just manually drag our block up to the top. So let's do that. Drag, drag, drag up to the top. And that's going to cause it to stay up at the top while it's kind of getting its kind of guts back up there. So here we go. There we go, looking a lot better. All right. So we can make one more change. And what I want to change is I want it to actually squash a little bit more when it hits the ground. That way it kind of has a bit of a recoil. So let's go ahead and add that, and it'll be the end of our first jump animation. So when it hits the ground, we're going to cause it to, the scale to come out a little bit more. So let's go ahead and move this here. Squash. Let's have this squash outward. To do that, I'm going to have to move my green block. Excuse me, green block. And let's go ahead and have this squish outward this time. 150. And in 50. And then we're going to have to adjust the position as well, because squashing it up means it's not on our floor any longer. So let's go ahead and adjust that down so that it looks like it's hitting against the floor. I'm kind of eyeballing it for now. Let's see. All right, so boink. Coming down. Needs to be a little bit lower. And let's kind of reset it back to its original state. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these keyframes because this is where it's perfect. So I can take those, Control C. I'll come back out here, Control V. And that's just going to be the quickest way for me to go from squashed back to normal. So let's see how this looks. Not bad. I still would like to see a little bit more of that position hang time. So I think I add a little bit of it right there. Let's go ahead and I'm going to drag this position keyframe out, which means it's going to stay up in the air just a little bit more while it regains its kind of composure, and then it's going to fall back down. So let's see how that looks. Zoop. There we go. Not bad.